So good morning. Welcome to the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA Preventive Controls Rule Fully Covered Facilities webinar. We are very pleased to have Aaron DiCaprio from the University of California, Davis with us again, as well as Jacob Guth and Anna Rivas from CCOF Certification Services Food Safety Program. And we're going to get started in a little bit with the official presentation of the webinar, but I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items first. And just to let you know, we're going to turn the video off during the presentations, but we'll come back on during the question and answer sessions. And we just want to let you know there are faces behind the voices, so we will be back shortly. So my name is Megan Donovan, and I'll be your host today. Behind the scenes, we have Larissa Hernandez providing technical assistance, and she'll be the one fielding the questions as they come in and may hop on as an alternative host if any technical issues arise. And the CCOF Foundation is pleased to collaborate with our partners to host today's webinar. Guided by the wisdom of our farming roots, the CCOF Foundation unites the organic community to advance organic agriculture. We offer intentional education, financial support, and growth opportunities for organic professionals. And we wanted to acknowledge that today's webinar is supported through a Food Safety Outreach Program grant from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Please note the contents of the webinar do not necessarily represent the official views of the USDA. And also note this webinar is not providing legal advice. So this is the third webinar in our four-part FSMA 101 for Organic Food Processor series. If you missed the first two webinars and want to check those out, visit the CCOF website for links to the recordings. And if you're having difficulties connecting to the webinar, if you can't hear or can't see, please call our office for support at 831-423-2263. Press 0 for the operator and someone will help you connect to the webinar. And finally, a quick Zoom tutorial. I know a lot of folks are Zoom experts by this point, but there can be some nuances with Zoom, so we'll just go over a quick review. To see the Zoom webinar controls, move your mouse over the image of the shared screen. If you're in full screen viewing mode and would prefer to view the webinar in a window, click the View Options tab at the top of the shared screen and select Exit Full Screen Mode to exit full screen. Throughout the webinar, we will stop from time to time for questions and answers. To send in questions or to communicate with our webinar staff, click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the shared screen. A question and answer box will pop open. Write in your questions and click Send. If you'd like to send your questions anonymously, check the Send Anonymously box on the left. And note, we won't be using the chat function during this webinar. So if you want to send a message in or having technical difficulties, just use the question and answer box. And feel free to send in questions at any time during the presentation. We'll collect those and then get to them during the question and answer breaks. At the end of the webinar, an invitation to take our evaluation survey will pop up. To take the survey, click on the link and answer a few quick questions to help us improve our offerings. And as a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll send a link of the recording along with the PDF of the PowerPoint slides to all webinar registrants. And just to let you know, we have a lot of folks in the audience today, which is really good. And we're going to try to get to as many questions and comments as we can, but we wanted to apologize in advance if we don't get to your specific question and encourage you to follow up after the webinar. So thanks again for attending. And with that, I'd like to introduce our lead trainer. Aaron DiCaprio is an assistant specialist in cooperative extension in the Department of Food Science and Technology at the University of California, Davis. Her expertise is in microbial food safety with an emphasis of foodborne viruses. And joining Aaron today, we have our California project partners, Jacob Guth and Anna Rivas from CCOF Certification Services Food Safety Program, and they'll be jumping in from time to time to answer organic specific food safety questions. So with that, I will hand things over to Erin. Again, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Megan, and good morning, everyone. Happy to be here today to talk about the FSMA, or Food Safety Modernization Act, Preventive Controls Rule for human food, and the requirements for fully covered facilities under that regulation. And so I'll just start kind of framing what we'll be covering today. We'll first go through the general requirements for fully covered facilities under the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule. We'll introduce the different components of the food safety plan for fully covered facilities under the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule. You are required to have developed a food safety plan as well as implemented that food safety plan for your business. We'll spend some time talking about the process of hazard analysis and some resources to help guide you through that process, because it can be very challenging if it's not something that you've done in the past or are very familiar with. And then we'll wrap up just speaking to what's required to show that you are in fact implementing that food safety plan in your business. Kind of kick us off here, we're going to start with a poll to get a sense of what folks in the audience are producing. So let us know via the poll what the business you are affiliated with processes. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the more common types of processed food products are here. Things like jams and jellies, pickles, fermented foods. But if your product is not on this list, you can go ahead and select other. Some folks may not currently be processing any food, so this may not be applicable as well. So we'll just leave this open for another second or two. I'm going to go ahead and end that poll, and now share the results with you all. So we have, sorry about that. We have one person that indicated dried fruits, vegetables, or herbs. One person that is producing canned vegetables. So I think those are two really good examples of two types of food products that are far apart on the food safety risk spectrum. So dried fruits, vegetables, and herbs, these are generally considered very low risk products. They can be produced under many states' cottage food laws. Canned vegetables, on the other hand, they're something that we have to take a lot more care when producing, because if they're not processed properly, canned vegetables can be a risk for causing botulism. And so these aren't products that you can produce under cottage food laws. In California, you would actually have to have a California cannery license to produce canned veggies. So really great to have kind of a diversity of products in the audience. And as we kind of go through the presentation today and get to the part of the discussion that's on the hazard analysis, we'll talk through some different product types and the different kinds of risks associated with those different products, and when you would need to implement a preventive control to control some of those hazards that are unique to individual products. So I just want to start out here giving an overview of who's covered by the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule. So all facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold human food are covered by this particular rule. In the previous webinar last month, we covered that there are modified requirements for qualified facilities under this rule. So these qualified facilities are those that gross less than $1 million in average annual sales adjusted for inflation. For facilities that have annual sales numbers that are greater than that $1 million threshold adjusted for inflation, the full requirements of the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule will apply. Today, we're going to go through the general requirements under this rule. And I just want to point out here, there's a full 2.5-day training course that goes through the specifics of this rule. So we're not going to get too deep today, but I just want to let everyone on the webinar here today know that we will, through this grant in the future, be offering this 2.5-day course. It's called the Preventive Controls Qualified Individual course. And so if you're interested, if this is something that, would be of benefit for you or your business, just know we're going to be offering that course in the future. But there are also opportunities to take that course through other entities as well. For a business that's fully subject to the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule, the full requirements under the regulation, so this is 21 CFR Part 117, are going to apply. These fully covered businesses are required to implement good manufacturing practices and other prerequisite programs that include sanitary operating procedures. And if you joined us in the previous webinar, the qualified facilities, so those businesses that gross less than that $1 million per year, are also required to be compliant with this portion of the regulation. So regardless of your food manufacturing business size, whether or not you're a fully covered or qualified facility, you will be required to implement good manufacturing practices and other prerequisite programs. A fully covered facility will also need to develop and implement a food safety plan. And one requirement of that food safety plan, or a piece of that food safety plan, and is really the foundation for that plan, is the hazard analysis. And we'll spend some time talking about that more in depth here today. Fully covered facilities also need to register with the FDA and will be subject to inspection. In California, the California Department of Public Health, Food and Drug Branch will be conducting FSMA Preventive Controls for Human Food inspections here in California on behalf of the FDA. So it's not likely that you would have an FDA inspector in your facility. You're going to have one of our state inspectors coming in and making sure that your facility is in fact in compliance with this particular regulation. So in this rule, there's a requirement that you go through this hazard analysis process, which is really a systematic approach to identifying potential hazards in your food and your process, and then implement controls for any of those hazards that you've identified. So I wanted to start here just reviewing the 3 general types of hazards that can occur in food and lead to foodborne illness. And so you'll have to be controlling all 3 of these types of hazards in your product and process. The first type of hazards are the physical hazards. These are items like glass, metal, wood that can inadvertently end up in a food and cause damage to a person's mouth or digestive tract if they ingest it. The second type of hazards are the chemical hazards. Chemical hazards include allergens. In the United States, there are 8 allergens called the Big 8 that are required to be on food labels if those foods contain any of those 8 allergens. The allergens are milk, eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, crustaceans, wheat, and soy. There, of course, are other types of chemical hazards as well. These could be processing chemicals or aids, sanitizing chemicals that could inadvertently end up in a food, pesticides, kind of the more common chemical kind of contaminants that we think of. The last group of hazards are the biological hazards. This group includes microorganisms that are transmitted by food and are pathogenic and can cause illness in humans. There are various types of microorganisms that can cause disease in humans, including bacteria, viruses, and parasites. The Preventive Controls Rule for human food requires food processors to identify these hazards that can impact the safety of their products. And if an identified hazard is considered reasonably likely to occur in that product, the manufacturer is then required to implement a preventive control to minimize the risks associated with that particular hazard. I also want to highlight here, there are numerous potential sources of these hazards. Some of them may be associated with ingredients used in a product. So if you're using eggs in a baked good, we know that salmonella, which is a bacterial pathogen, is commonly associated with eggs. And so you would need a control for that hazard coming in on that particular ingredient. There may be other ingredients where a physical hazard might be of concern. Blueberries, for example, oftentimes are subject to pest infiltration, so birds coming in on the plants. And so a hazard that's been identified for blueberries is actually metal fragments coming off bird shot to help control for those birds. So you do want to think about the ingredients coming into your facility and any potential hazards that might be associated with those ingredients. The environment, the food processing environment here is what I'm talking about, is another potential source of these hazards. There are bacterial pathogens, especially, that are known to become resident in food processing facilities. And in that case, if there isn't rigorous cleaning and sanitation in those facilities, if there aren't controls on how food products move through facilities, that environment can be a source of microbial hazards. People are also a really important source of some of these hazards, including all 3 types. So physical hazards, this is why we don't have folks in our food processing facilities wearing jewelry, because jewelry can fall off and end up in a food product and then be a physical hazard. People can also move chemical hazards around a food processing facility. There was one product recall that I'm familiar with where an individual was eating cheese puffs in the break room. So that cheese is a milk allergen. They then didn't wash their hands, went back into the food processing facility and contaminated product that didn't contain a milk allergen with that allergen, introducing a chemical hazard into that product. Of course, people, we get sick. If we're sick, we can shed pathogens in either our vomit or our feces. If we're not washing our hands, we can easily cross-contaminate foods. So employee hygiene and training is really critical for mitigating those hazards. But just be aware that these hazards can come in from numerous sources and impact the safety of your product. The Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule is based on developing risk-based preventive controls for food safety hazards. So by applying a systematic approach to identify the most likely hazards to implement, or the most likely hazards that are going to impact a product's safety, a system can then be developed to prevent these risks in that particular product and minimize food safety hazards. And so the preventive controls that are ultimately going to be developed and implemented, these work in conjunction and are supported by other programs like good manufacturing practices. And so, as I already said, good manufacturing practices, they're required for all food processing facilities, regardless if that's a qualified facility, a smaller food business, or a fully covered facility under the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule, because these good manufacturing practices are really the kind of the basic foundation for food safety for a food processor. So the overall goal of the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule is to have food processing facilities build a food safety system within that facility. So the good manufacturing practices, these are really those base level things that have to be done to mitigate food safety risks, and they serve as the foundation for this food safety program. We're going to have a fourth webinar in this series that focuses on good manufacturing practices, but generally GMPs include things like making sure your employees wash their hands, that your equipment is routinely cleaned and sanitized, etc. After these good manufacturing practices, the hazard analysis is the next most important piece of the food safety system. The hazard analysis is a systematic review of your product and process that highlights all the potential hazards in your product and your process. Then those hazards are essentially ranked as something that is going to be controlled by good manufacturing practices or other prerequisite programs. Or is this hazard something that is reasonably foreseeable in our product? It's not going to be controlled by those good manufacturing practices, and now is something that's going to require us as a manufacturer to implement a preventive control to reduce the risk associated with that particular hazard. There are 4 types of preventive controls that can be implemented. They include process controls, which are, if you're familiar with HACCP systems, under that system called critical control points. And these process controls are things that you are doing within your facility to control a particular hazard, like thermal processing, heating your product, acidifying your product. So typically these are going to be things that are part of your food manufacturing process. Sanitation preventive controls are those that control for hazards in the environment that may cross-contaminate ready-to-eat food. So these are often going to be required if you have an allergen in one product that you produce in a facility, but that allergen isn't present in another product that you're producing. You would need a sanitation to control, preventive control implemented there to mitigate the risk of allergen cross contact. So that allergen ending up in the product that is not supposed to have any allergens in it. Allergen preventive controls are those that aim to reduce allergen mislabeling. Allergen mislabeling is the number one reason for recalls in this country. We do have a significant number of food recalls. A majority of those are due to allergen mislabeling. So these allergen preventive controls are implemented to reduce the likelihood of allergen mislabeling. And then supply chain preventive controls are those that are needed when you've identified that a particular ingredient you're sourcing may harbor a hazard, but you are relying on the supplier of that particular ingredient to control the hazard. It's not something you're doing in your business model. So you're going to implement a system where you're ensuring that that supplier is in fact controlling for that hazard. The hazard analysis, the preventive controls, so actually outlining what those preventive controls are, and all other documentation related to the monitoring of those preventive controls, verifying that those preventive controls are being implemented, and any corrective actions. So corrective actions are essentially documentation of what you did when a preventive control was not implemented properly and you needed to go back and fix that issue. So all of those documents make up the food safety plan. In addition, a recall plan is also required in the food safety plan if at least one hazard is identified that requires a preventive control. And that recall plan is going to outline the procedures that are going to be undertaken in the scenario where a food product needs to be recalled. Again, this food safety plan is going to be required for food processors that are fully covered by the preventive controls for human food rule. So just know, if you're a fully covered facility, you need to have a food safety plan. So this food safety plan is required, and there are certain components that must be included in the plan. There are other components that are useful, but are not required under the regulation. So required pieces are in this blue box here on this slide. A hazard analysis must be included in the food safety plan. So there are training courses on conducting hazard analysis, as well as lots of templates available for documenting that hazard analysis process out there. So just be aware that you don't necessarily have to go into this blind or start from scratch with developing documentation. This would be really, the hazard analysis would be the minimum of what's required in the plan. So you at a bare minimum have to conduct the hazard analysis, have that documentation. If during that hazard analysis, one hazard is identified that requires a preventive control, the other sections in this blue box are going to be required. And so it would be very rare to have a product that does not have at least one hazard that requires a preventive control. One example might be vinegar. Depending how that vinegar is being produced, there may be no hazards that require a control. But that's really the only example that I've come across where there wasn't at least one of these hazards that required a preventive control to be implemented. And so if there is a hazard and you need a preventive control, then you have to define what that preventive control is within the food safety plan. For a process preventive control, you're also going to need a validation study, which is essentially a study done by you or an external party, or that's already been done by someone. in the food processing, food science field that shows the control that you are implementing does in fact minimize the hazard that you've identified. That validation is not required for other types of preventive controls. A recall plan is also going to be required if at least one hazard identified requires a preventive control. And then additionally, you're going to have in that food safety plan the procedures for monitoring, verification, corrective actions related to your preventive control, and also the records for all of those activities as well. Other information that's useful is listed here, including facility overview, product description, flow diagram, process description, but those are not required elements under the regulation. So the food safety plan does have to be specific to a facility, and the preventive controls are specific to a product and process. And so one of the things that I'll just call out right here, a lot of folks that are smaller businesses that don't have someone familiar with hazard analysis or, building food safety or HACCP plans will go to an external party to develop their food safety plan. And I will just say, proceed with caution there. I've seen a lot of HACCP plans that have nothing to do with the process that's actually going on in the facility. So if you are going externally to a consultant to help you develop the food safety plan, just make sure that you're involved or someone else within your business is involved in that process to make sure it accurately reflects the product and the process that's going on in your facility. You are able to group like products if the hazards are the same and the preventive controls that are implemented are similar as well. So if you just have products that are slightly different, a baked good that has a little bit different ingredients, but none of those different ingredients are allergens, you likely can group those baked goods together because, they're going to go through the same cooking process, which is the process preventive control. You do have to address all of the biological, chemical, and physical hazards identified needing control in that food safety plan. So you can't just ignore physical hazards or ignore biological hazards. You have to address all three types of hazards in the food safety plan. The format of the food safety plan is flexible. There's no one way you have to do it. There's no specific template that the regulatory agencies say you have to use. However, that being said, there are some really useful templates available out there. Long history of hazard analysis, dating back to the first implementation of some of the HACCP regulations. So there are a lot of forms and templates out there for you to use. I'll also kind of point out here, if you're using electronic records, if you're developing your food safety plan electronically, just know that these electronic records must adhere to certain standards to ensure they can't be altered after original generation. Was pointed out on our webinar yesterday, targeted to Washington folks, that you also want to make sure those documents are backed up. So if a computer crashes, you don't lose all of your documentation, because you do have to retain these records for a 2-year period. And I'll get into this point again later, but this food safety plan must be created by a preventive controls qualified individual. And I'll define what a preventive controls qualified individual, what that means. You may see this abbreviated PCQI. But yeah, more on that to come. So now I'll walk through some of the main organizational sections of the food safety plan and give a little bit more detail about each one of these sections. So this first section I'm going to talk about, this is the background information. And this is all optional, but this is very helpful information, I would say. It's helpful internally for your food safety team, for management, but externally, it's also really helpful for inspectors because it gives them context to your entire food safety plan. So this background information can include, a facility overview that has information on, the square footage of your facility, the kind of products that are being made in the facility, operational hours, number of staff, and the representatives that are part of your food safety or quality assurance team. A product and process description is also helpful. So this gives a description of what you're making, how it's processed, packaged, how it's stored. The flow diagram is also very helpful. So this gives kind of very detailed step-by-step directions of your entire process, kind of from start to finish. So from receiving ingredients and packaging all the way to final storage and shipping. The flow diagram is also a tool that's recommended for conducting your hazard analysis. So the next section is, excuse me, I'm coughing a little. A lot to talk about. So the next section is the hazard analysis. And as I already said, this is really the critical piece to the food safety plan because it's going to drive what preventive controls are implemented. And so hazard analysis has to be included in the food safety plan at a minimum. So, you may have no hazards that need a control and the other sections won't apply, but at a minimum, you have to have this hazard analysis. So I'll spend a bit more time talking about hazard analysis before going into the other sections because it is so critical. And so this is a systematic process where for each step in your process flow from receiving ingredients to product leaving the facility, you have to determine if there are potential hazards at that particular step. Once you've identified those hazards, an evaluation needs to take place to determine if that hazard requires a preventive control. So how severe and also how likely that hazard is to occur in that particular step is one parameter that's evaluated here. If that hazard is severe and likely, then an assessment of whether your good manufacturing practices control that hazard is done. But if that hazard is not addressed by those programs, then the hazard may require a preventive control. So the hazard analysis is really one of the most challenging parts of this process, and it can be hard to determine what kinds of hazards are likely or reasonably foreseeable to occur in different products. So an important first step here is gathering data. And so this can be information on previous recalls or outbreaks in products like your own. This could be information from scientific reports or other guidance documents. It's important too, as you're gathering data, to not only look at products that are exactly like your own, which there may not be data existing for if you have a really unique niche product, but you also want to look at products in related categories or even raw ingredients that you're using. So I'm going to walk through a few examples here just to kind of highlight this approach of gathering data. I'm showing here the FDA's recall site. Both FDA and USDA post recall information on their website, so you can search by food category there, and that's a good place to start gathering data. But I'll point you to some other resources as well. So the first example I want to walk through is ice cream. So I'm a new ice cream processor. And so I do a quick search of the FDA's recall and outbreak database, and you can see here that there have been a number of recalls associated with ice cream over the last 5 years or so. So it's important to look at, in these recalls, what particular hazard caused that recall and see if you can pick out a trend. So you can see for 6 of these 7 recalls, Listeria monocytogenes, which is a bacterial foodborne pathogen, was the reason for those recalls. There was also one other recall where pathogenic E. coli was the reason for the recall. So that's another foodborne bacterial pathogen. So given this data as a new ice cream processor, I would certainly identify Listeria monocytogenes as a hazard needing a control due to the number of recalls associated with that particular pathogen and ice cream. I would also likely include pathogenic E. coli as a hazard needing control because there was one recall related to that particular pathogen. And I will point out here as well, there is a distinction between recalls and outbreaks. So recalls are not always associated or due to people getting sick. In all of these examples I'm listing here, regulatory agencies did some routine product testing and found these pathogens in final product, and that's what initiated the recall. So no one reported getting sick from eating these products. This was due to a positive test result. Outbreaks are defined as 2 or more people becoming ill from the same causative agent after consuming the same food product. So an outbreak, of course, is also going to cause a recall. But when you're going through and gathering data, I would search, both recalls and outbreaks. And the reason why these regulatory agencies were testing all of these ice cream products was that there was a large outbreak caused by ice cream in 2015 due to contamination with Listeria monocytogenes. This outbreak was linked to a large-scale ice cream producer that actually had products that were being contaminated in 2 separate production facilities. So if there is an outbreak in a product like yours, the best practice is to dig into that outbreak and try and find out what went wrong that led to that particular outbreak. So oftentimes you can find the FDA Form 483. This is the FDA's inspection report from outbreak investigation. So they'll be redacted, so there's no identifying information, but it will contain the information that's kind of the why of why this outbreak happened. So in this particular case, the ice cream manufacturer had positive products and environmental swabs for Listeria monocytogenes. However, the corrective actions that they undertook were not effective. So it's important to see what goes wrong in these outbreaks so these mistakes aren't going to be repeated. So in this case, an environmental pathogen, Listeria monocytogenes, was present in a freezer tunnel, and a drain outside of the freezer tunnel. So the facility knew this. They tried to implement corrective action. So they cleaned and sanitized, but that wasn't effective in controlling the hazard. And therefore, people ultimately got sick and their facility was shut down. So I will just say, if there's an outbreak in a product like yours, see if you can find this kind of detailed information as to what happened that led to that outbreak. Another resource that I want to point you to here is a guidance document from FDA. So this resource lists potential biological, chemical, and physical hazards for different product categories and processes. So you can see here for ice cream products, the FDA has flagged pathogenic E. coli, Listeria monocytogenes, as well as Salmonella as a hazard in ice cream. So this guidance is really helpful, especially for those with less experience in conducting a hazard analysis, to kind of pick out those hazards that, at least from FDA's perspective, are reasonable and foreseeable to control in your, or to occur in your product and require a preventive control. So another example here is a refrigerated soup product. And so oftentimes refrigerated products can have less regulatory stringency than other types of shelf-stable products. However, in refrigerated products, temperature abuse can cause significant hazards. So one really important consideration for a product that is heated during processing and then cooled for refrigerated storage, like soup, is making sure that cooling down process is controlled and that cooling happens in a rapid fashion to reduce the risk of microbial pathogen growth during cooling. There are some types of bacterial pathogens like Clostridium perfringens, the bacteria that caused this outbreak, that can form bacterial spores. So these bacterial spores are very heat tolerant. So boiling during cooking of soup isn't going to inactivate those spores. And then if that soup is cooled down too slowly, the spores can germinate. You then have vegetative bacteria growing in that product and producing toxin, which can then lead to disease. So, this cooling process for anything that's heated and then cooled down for refrigeration or freezing needs to be controlled to mitigate these risks. And so if we look at this guidance document again from FDA for soup, sauces, and gravies that are ready to eat, refrigerated, there are several microbial hazards flagged. They include Clostridium perfringens, so that the outbreak that I just showed you, as well as two other spore-forming bacterial pathogens, Bacillus cereus and Clostridium botulinum. And then Salmonella and Listeria monocytogenes are also flagged here. Both Salmonella and Listeria monocytogenes are considered environmental pathogens. So they're typically going to be flagged in any product that is ready to eat, that is exposed to the environment in the food processing facility after a kill step. So for soup, the heating process is likely going to be that kill step. We have a huge batch of soup in a kettle. If we're then packaging that soup into individual containers, and that container is open, and then we're applying a lid, that's exposure to the environment after the kill step. And FDA, other state regulators are likely going to be flagging for some of these environmental pathogens being a risk in those types of products. I just quickly here wanted to give an example of a chemical hazard in a product. So this is chocolate used for baking. So you can see for chocolate, heavy metals, unapproved colors and additives, and natural toxins are being flagged as chemical hazards. So this is a high value product that's produced outside of the US. And so different countries may have different environmental or food safety standards. There may also be potential for economic adulteration of some product types. So just to highlight here that beyond the biological hazards, which were highlighted in the last two examples, you would also want to look and see if there are any chemical hazards that are flagged for your products in this guidance document. And then I just wanted to give one example of a physical hazard here. So this is a carbonated beverage. And I show this example because you can see here glass is flagged. So glass, when product is packed in glass, anyone that is packaging a product in a glass container, regardless if it's a beverage or a food, a salsa, some kind of other food product, glass is going to be a hazard that is reasonable and foreseeable. And so that processor has to have a glass management plan, reduce the risk of that glass hazard for the end consumer. So let's take a pause here and address any questions that may have come in over the last hour. Wow.
Great. Thanks, Erin. And yeah, thank you for the overview and kind of the process that a new processor would go through to kind of do some research into what hazards they might need to pay attention to for their food safety plan. And so we wanted to open it up to questions. Feel free to write them in and we will address them during the question and answer session. And I think to start off with, one of the things I've heard from sort of newer processors that are new to food safety and hazard analysis is they'll do their research, they'll look at the different outbreaks and recalls, and then they kind of overdo it on the hazards that they identify, wanting to be really careful and make sure their product is safe. But then due to the fact that they identify a lot of hazards, then their food safety plan is, they have a lot they need to address and keep records for. And so do you have any recommendations for, again, folks that are new in how to identify hazards and have a safe product, but not kind of overdo it?
I did the same thing. I will say the first time that I went through a HACCP course, I flagged so many hazards that needed a control. And I would say hazard analysis is really challenging, and it's something that with practice becomes, you become better at it. You are able to pick out the hazards that really require the control faster. So I would say just try not to get frustrated if you're having those challenges the first time you do it. If you are working through the process, if you haven't attended a HACCP course or the Preventive Controls Qualified Individual course, I'd suggest that. The instructors of those courses have a lot of experience in hazard analysis, and you're actually going to be doing hazard analysis in those classes. So you'll get to talk through, why one hazard needs a preventive control where another doesn't. I would also, there are examples of model food safety plans that include the hazard analysis. There are example HACCP plans out there too. So looking at some of those examples, you will list every hazard you can think of during the hazard analysis. So you'll get to see in those examples all the hazards they list, but they won't identify a preventive control as being required for all of those hazards. So you'll kind of see which kind of hazards, which kind of steps in the process are those that are elevated to requiring or needing that preventive control. The FDA guidance document that I showed some screenshots of is also really helpful. They will list a lot, but I think it is not, I think it's a reasonable list of hazards they have there. So that's another good place to go if you're kind of struggling with, exactly what you need to be controlling for in your product. But it's a learned process. You're not gonna be great at it the first time you do it. It does take time to kind of learn what hazards are the most important for you to focus on and control. The FDA, the state regulators, they're looking for you to control the most likely, the most reasonably foreseeable hazard to be controlled in your product. You can kind of envision scenarios where, you could have a hazard that, maybe there's a very slight off chance that this could happen. You can always kind of imagine situations like that, but, gathering that data, looking at examples, if there are outbreaks in a product like yours due to a particular hazard, that would be reasonably foreseeable and something you would want to control for.
Great, thank you. And then another question came in wondering about suggestions for a reliable source of templates for food safety and hazard analysis.
So later on, we're going to share a link with you to the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance homepage. So the FSPCA, Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance, is the group that worked to develop the standardized training curriculum for the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule. And so there's a training manual associated with that course. They have template hazard analysis forms. They have template forms for documenting, establishing your preventive controls. They have model records. And so that's a really good place to go and start. There are also templates available from different university extension groups. But I think if you're looking, I like the forms from FSPCA. I think they're comprehensive. I think they're user-friendly. You also have to accompany them actual examples of a complete food safety plan to reference. You can actually look at that plan to see how they're using the form. So I think that's a really good starting point. But again, there's no standard template format you have to use. So if you absolutely hate those templates, just know they're not something you have to utilize.
Great, thank you. So I think that's a good segue into the next half of the presentation. And if people have more questions about record keeping and forms, we can get to that later in our second question and answer session.
All right. So after you've done that hazard analysis, the hazards requiring controls will have been identified. Next is time to determine which type of control you're going to be utilizing. So the process preventive controls, as I already mentioned, these are under the HACCP system, your critical control points. So a process preventive control, these are the things that you're doing during the process to minimize a hazard. So this could be cooking for a specific time or temperature, or needing to adjust to a certain pH or achieve a certain water activity in your product, etc. The documentation for the process preventive control will have what's called the critical limits for the control, i.e., what specific parameters need to be achieved to control the hazard. So I need 160 degrees Fahrenheit for 35 minutes or something of that nature. And then for the process preventive controls, you also need a validation study and documentation, which shows either through work done by you or by others that the specific parameters of that process control address the identified hazard. So that validation piece can also be really hard for someone just that's new to the food industry. And so in that FSPCA manual, there's a chapter on validation and some resources, but I think probably talking through with someone would be the most helpful. So myself, others in Extension are always happy to have those conversations with you. So allergen preventive controls, those are established to ensure that appropriate allergen-containing labels are placed on allergenic products. So you have to have specific details on how you're going to do that, that are written down and documented. Also, if you have a unique allergen in a product in your facility and you're running multiple products, not all of them, have that same allergen. You would also have a plan for minimizing allergen cross contact. Usually this is going to be not through implementation of an allergen preventive control, but through the implementation of a sanitation preventive control, where you have a very regimented, documented practice where you're cleaning and sanitizing that production line between running your allergen containing product and your non-allergenic product. You will also have to have sanitation preventive controls if you've identified environmental pathogens as a concern as a hazard for your products. So again, that's Listeria monocytogenes and Salmonella. Typically, these are going to be an issue in ready to eat type products that are exposed to the environment post-processing. We've had a number of issues in frozen products too, because there's contamination during that freezing process. So you'd have a sanitation preventive control that's a very rigorous cleaning and sanitizing program to minimize the risk associated with those two pathogens establishing themselves in your processing environment. And then the supply chain preventive controls are those where a hazard is identified in an ingredient, but you are relying on a supplier to control that hazard. And so these can be a little tricky to implement depending on where you're sourcing your ingredients. So if this is a large scale ingredient supplier of pasteurized eggs, you would, do some vetting of that supplier, and that would include doing a food safety audit. So this could be something done by someone in your business. You have someone that's familiar with food safety that goes into that supplier's facility, does their own audit. I would say most people opt for a third-party audit. So having that third-party audit and the certificate from that audit in hand from your supplier. You would also have, strict lot control of product and, require some certificate of conformance or analysis accompanying those lots of products to show, we followed the scheduled process. We sent our pasteurized eggs for testing. They were Salmonella negative. But then you would probably also, best practice, be doing some of that testing on your own. So, randomly selecting lots of these pasteurized eggs to send for salmonella testing. It can get more challenging if you're working with a smaller supplier. I've done some work with food hubs where they're sourcing produce from growers that are so small, they're exempt from the FSMA Produce Safety Rule requirements. They don't have a third-party audit. So there are mechanisms and certain documentation you can get from suppliers that have exemptions from food safety regs to address the supply chain preventive controls as well. So a written recall plan is also required for any product where one hazard requiring a control is identified. And this plan outlines what to do when something goes wrong. And there's a very comprehensive example of a recall plan in the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance Preventive Controls Qualified Individual Manual, which you can download for free from their website. It's also available for free in multiple languages besides English. So this table of contents here, this is just a screen shot from that example recall plan. And so I show it here just to kind of highlight the different types of information to include in your recall plan. So important to have the recall team defined, a strategy defined for communicating with regulatory agencies, your customers, and the general public. The recall plan should, also include, what methods that you're going to use to collect information on the specific products, lot codes, volumes that need to be recalled. You also need to have a robust traceability system put in place that allows you to connect to individuals that may have this product impacted by the recall in hand. Also important to have a traceability backwards. So ingredients that you're receiving being able to go backwards as well. There's so many examples of recalls where, there was salmonella in a potato chip. The potato chips were recalled, but then they found out the source of that outbreak was actually a spice blend used in the barbecue chips. So they then, had to go backwards. And then that spice supplier had to inform all of the customers that bought that spice that it was contaminated, and recall expanded. So having that traceability system where you can go backwards to your source, but then also forward all the way to the customer level or consumer level if possible is really recommended and important. And then the remaining section of the food safety plan is essentially everything that's needed to show that you are in fact implementing this plan. So this includes the validation studies for your preventive controls. Again, this is just for your process controls only where you need that validation piece. It also includes the records for monitoring your preventive controls, the verification activities related to monitoring preventive controls. So this can include record review, verification, also includes things like calibration of equipment used for monitoring. And then you also have to have documentation related to any corrective actions that occurred because a process deviated from the preventive control you established. So that corrective action will essentially outline what happened, what you did to fix the problem, the issue, and then a root cause analysis. So what happened to cause that deviation in the first place? So records of all of that also need to be collected and included in the food safety plan. So a preventive controls individual needs to prepare the food safety plan. So this can be someone in-house or it can be someone external, but it's important that this individual knows the business well. You want the food safety plan to match your product and process. Some consultants, they'll give you a very generic food safety plan that may not reflect what's actually happening in your facility. So this preventive controls qualified individual is defined on the slide here. So this is what's actually in the regulation. Most people opt to take the preventive controls qualified individual course. This is a 2.5-day course. There's also in-person course. There's also a hybrid option where you do some self-learning online and then have a 1-day in-person course that's primarily kind of working through the development of the food safety plan. So doing your hazard analysis, developing preventive controls. So, I think that's the option most folks go with. You get a certificate that's good for lifetime. And that's something that you can show any inspector coming into the facility. It's also, written in the regulation that, this is someone that can, based on experience, be a qualified individual. It's not well defined in the regulation. How is an inspector going to make that judgment? So again, most people just opt to take the course. It's also really helpful because it does help, get into the nitty-gritty details of the regulation as well. So this preventive controls qualified individual needs to develop the food safety plan. They will also be the person that needs to do the validation work. So that could be, running internal studies. It could also be, digging through existing data for that validation study. They need to be involved in records review, and they also need to conduct the reanalysis of the food safety plan. So the food safety plan is not a one and done deal. It needs to be reanalyzed, updated. I believe it's every 2 years. And then if there is any recall issue like that, that's also going to, that food safety plan is also going to need to be reanalyzed after that event. Fully covered facilities also have to register with FDA. This can be done online, and it's recommended that you do it online, and you need to renew this registration every 2 years. In California, you'll also have to go through our state registration process. For folks that are manufacturing low acid or acidified canned foods, you're going to need to go through the cannery licensing process. For everyone else, it's the processed food registration. So you'll have to register both with the state and the FDA. But in terms of inspection, you're going to have state inspectors in your facility and not folks from the FDA. In most cases, there's always exceptions to the rule. This is the general information you need when you're registering with FDA: name of your facility, where you are, what you're making. It's not something that's going to take a significant amount of time to do. And then in terms of frequency of inspection, so for our low acid and acidified canned food producers in the state, that you have inspectors in your facility all of the time. So we in California are unique in that we have lot by lot release of our low acid and acidified products. And so you're going to have an inspector in your facility often, more frequent than a few times or every 2 to 3 years. For other types of processors in California, your inspections are not going to be that frequent. So if you're operating under the processed food registration, you may kind of at a, the highest frequency, have an annual inspection, but more likely that it's going to be every 2 years or so that you would have an inspector in your facility. And then I just want to highlight here some of the more commonly occurring inspection violations for smaller processors. Some of it's related to just infrastructure. So having floor wall ceilings that can be cleaned and sanitized, having proper screening and barriers for pest exclusion. That's something that's pretty commonly found in some smaller operations. And then the other biggie, I would say, it's just around monitoring and record keeping, sanitation, cleaning and sanitation records, really important. I've heard it multiple times from our state inspectors. And then with the food safety plan, this is a record heavy document. And so making sure that you do have all of those records to support implementation of your preventive controls, as well as your good manufacturing practices. So record keeping, critically important. If you don't write it down, it doesn't happen, unfortunately. So just make sure that you are keeping those records under this regulation. Those records need to be retained for 2 years. And so for FDA inspection, again, this a little less relevant for California because we're going to have our state inspectors in. There are fees associated with the cost of inspection. So with the registration fees for the PFR and the cannery license, those inspection fees are built in. If there is, if you are a cannery, then you also have to pay the hourly fees for the inspectors coming in to do that lot by lot release. Under the PFR, if there's any need for a reinspection, you're also going to be paying the inspector hourly rate for those re-inspections. But those initial inspections, they're built into the state registration fees. And then a couple of food safety resources. I know you probably saw these come through in the chat too, but that guidance document from FDA, really, really helpful. They have tables on biological, chemical, and physical hazards. And then the Preventive Controls Qualified Individual Manual. This is a link to their website, but you can easily scroll down and download the entire manual. At the end of that manual, that's where all the template forms are located, but I believe you can also download those template forms independently on their website as well. And then organic resources, a lot of handy things for our organic processors. I've really been kind of ignoring that side of things through the talk and focusing on food safety, but I think there are a lot of overlaps. Both food safety and organic have a lot of record keeping requirements. Traceability is really critical on both pieces. So I might ask if anybody wants to jump in here and speak to the overlaps between both, but I think for both organic and food safety programs, the record keeping as well as establishing that traceability system is really critical.
Aaron, I'll jump in and add one thing that I was thinking about was the supply chain program requirement in the FSMA Preventative Controls. If an operation just adds kind of that organic certificate verification to their suppliers, that's one thing you'd want to add. But you're right, there's a lot of overlap between the organic regulations and the food safety regulations. And and the preventative controls. And I think you did a good job of describing those today. So thank you.
Great. So we'll open it up if there are any other remaining questions hanging out there. I know it's again a heavy topic, and there's 2.5-day course that covers it more in depth, but happy to address any questions that folks have.
Great, yeah, so again, if you have questions, feel free to go ahead and write them in. And I think to start, we kind of touched on the topic of traceability and supplier verification, but Erin, do you want to go, or Jacob, do you want to talk a little more detail about sort of what documentations would qualify for that section and having the documentations you need for supplier verification?
Sure.
You go ahead.
Go ahead, Erin. Oh, well, we already talked about, adding the organic certificates to that supply chain program that's required by FSMA. And then in terms of recall, that also overlaps with the organic requirements, because during an organic inspection, your inspector will want to trace items back, your ingredients really back to those suppliers, and make sure that not only does each supplier have a food safety program, that's what the food safety program is meant to check, but that you're also sourcing organic ingredients. So traceability backwards is really important and then forwards for the recall on the food safety side, so that you can notify your customers should anything happen to one of your production processes. So, yeah.
And I'll just add, so, there is, the supply chain preventive control is one piece. So that's, the instance where you're relying on that supplier to control a hazard for you. So that's kind of a next level of supplier verification. But there's also kind of, the baseline, just supplier verification activity where, you want to know your suppliers well, make sure you're getting consistent quality products. So, having lot information, certificates of conformance, certificates of analysis, that would be something you would want from all of your suppliers, regardless if you're relying on them to control a particular hazard in a product. So I'm just, kind of thinking, if I'm sourcing flour from someone and I'm going to incorporate it into a chocolate chip cookie, I'm going to bake that cookie. That's a kill step. There may not be other hazards in that flour other than some biological ones that I'm controlling on my own. So I won't have to go to that next level of requiring a food safety audit of that particular supplier, which would be the case if I'm relying on that supplier to control a particular hazard on my behalf. So it does, I think the supply chain preventive control can get kind of lumped in with kind of what you should be doing anyways as your supplier verification and having that established traceability system. So hopefully I didn't confuse it more. That wasn't the intention. But, I think for all your suppliers, having, you certainly want to know who they are, have contact information, mailing addresses, always best practice to have, their certificates of analysis, certificates of conformance. I would even, even if they're not someone you're working with where there's a supply chain preventive control, if they have third-party audits, getting hold of those certificates as well. It's only going to serve you positively. It's not going to be a negative. But if this is a supplier that you're relying on to control a hazard, then you have to have that third-party audit from them, other documentation that, if they're a really small processor, kind of stands in for that third-party audit. So, but traceability, supplier verification, just because of, kind of as you get more complicated products and you can have so many, they're just examples of outbreaks and recalls where, because of the complicated nature of the supply chain, those outbreaks, recalls just kept expanding. And in some cases, before these requirements for a robust traceability system, it led to more product being recalled that probably should have been, just because the processor couldn't trace where all of this contaminated ingredient ended up. So sorry, I digressed a little bit there.
Great. No, thank you. That was a good overview, and I think kind of gets at the complexity of all of this. And so we had a number of more questions come in that I'd like to see if we can address. I know we're getting close to the end of the webinar, and one of them was wondering, are there any third-party companies that can work with food processors to prepare food safety plans that you can recommend? And is there an estimate on how much they typically cost?
So, I have a website that I maintain along with another extension specialist in food safety that's in food science. It's ucfoodsafety.ucdavis.edu. And on that page, there is a list of consultants there that can provide support for developing food safety plans. I personally don't have any recommendations of who to reach out to. I would just proceed with caution. I might kind of have a rubric that I developed when trying to figure out who to work with, just in terms like, I would be really hesitant to work with someone that isn't willing to come into my facility on a routine basis, see operations. And so, I'd refer you to that page, but I don't have any specific recommendations on that.
I'll add that, getting a third-party food safety audit really does help operations prepare, whether it's on the farm side or facility side, because there are a lot of overlap between some of the private food safety standards and the FSMA food safety standards. So I've noticed people, when they do get a third-party audit, it does prepare them well. Now, those people can't help you set up your plan, but they can help you verify that your plan is your food safety plan is being carried out. And sometimes, or oftentimes, buyers and customers require that third-party verification and certification. So there's a number of agencies out there that do that.
Great, thank you. And then another question that came in was, is there a minimum revenue exemption for companies to register with FDA, or do all processors need to register regardless of size?
So basically everyone has to register with FDA. The added piece for a small business, so those less than $1 million in annual sales, you also have to submit to them facility attestation form. So it's you register and then you submit this attestation form that basically states you're a small business and that you're exempt from the full requirements of the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule, but you're complying with your state and local food safety regulations. So yeah, everybody has to register, but if you're a small business, you also file that second attestation form. So you're kind of off the inspection list for preventive controls.
Great, thank you. So I think we're at time and we have a couple more things to touch on before we wrap up formally. So I just wanted again to thank Erin and Jacob and Anna and Larissa for joining us and supporting this webinar. It's been a great overview. And also got some good resources and ideas for where to go to learn more about how to put together your food safety plan for FSMA. So, and I know there was a question coming in about types of trainings and what will be offered. And as Erin noted earlier, this is a part of a larger education program that we're putting together for organic processors. And we wanted to get your input on what types of trainings you want to see. So if you want to go ahead and let us know what type of future trainings you would like to see. You know, someone wrote in the question and answer that they're looking for the preventive controls for qualified individuals training. And that is something we are sort of included in part of this grant that we are hoping to offer. And then, but there's also a lot of other types of food safety trainings out there. So just want to take a moment and let us know what you're interested in seeing next. I'll give folks a few more seconds to respond. And just to note, as things are coming in, there's a number of different items. So I think I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. And it looks like, I'll share the results. Preventative controls for qualified individuals training, there's definitely some interest there, as well as juice HACCP and basic manufacturing practices. So that is good to know, and thank you. We, again, will be in touch through CCOF, UC Davis, and other communication channels as to what we're offering next. And speaking of upcoming events, we will be having a webinar in December on current good manufacturing practices. So you can find out more and register on the CCOF website. And then also, if you missed any of the previous trainings and are interested in other, if you're a grower and interested in FSMA for on the grower side, we have a lot of resources on the CCOF YouTube channel. And Erin, I think you also have another opportunity for people to kind of give feedback on training development.
Yeah, just really quickly, I'm working towards building an online food safety training program for food processors. And right now we're just looking for input. If what we're thinking would be useful will really be useful at all. So if you're, working in any capacity in food safety or training in your business and you're willing to take some time to chat with us, you can reach out to me. The grad student working on the project's also here. It would be, a less than 1 hour interview, and we compensate you for sharing your perspectives with us. Oh, thanks.
Great, thank you. And then we also just wanted to let folks know the CCOF Foundation also offers various different types of grants, and our future organic farmer grants for middle school and high school students through the FFA organization are open right now. So if you have a young person in your life that's involved with FFA and looking to do an organic focused project, You can find out more information and send them to our website. And it's always really great every year to see all of the enthusiastic young folks and all of the projects that they're doing. So we enjoy both learning about their projects and funding them. So send them our way. And with that, I'd like to wrap up the webinar. Thanks again to our speakers. And as noted at the beginning, there's an evaluation form that's going to pop up after the webinar, and we'd love your feedback. So thank you and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks, Erin.
Thanks,